So, agriculture is a big word. So actually, before I actually start presenting, I want some of you to write in the chat box what are the keywords that you think of when you hear the word agriculture. So, okay. Okay, yeah, so soil, crop, land, farming, food management. Yeah, okay, so I think that's good. I guess we can all agree that the basis of agriculture is actually defined in its own name. So agri in Latin means field and culture means cultivation. Therefore, cultivating a piece of land or planting and growing food on it is largely what agriculture means, right? Of course, this definition still sounds kind of broad, especially when we look at all the agricultural practices today. So agriculture does include land cultivation, but it also includes pest control, or growing fish and building greenhouses, and breeding plants and composting. Okay, it's a whole lot of things, very confusing. Especially when it's changing day after day and when our lives are so detached from it and frankly when no one knows what the hell is happening. Like when you have something that has been changing for years, like from the start of civilization and has been practiced all over the world, it is actually bound to appear a little complex. Just like we evolved as humans, agriculture evolved or changed with us, and it took many shapes along the way. So from industrial, small scale, vertical agriculture, there are so many types of agriculture, and I won't be listing all of them. What I will be doing is basically explaining how agriculture can exist by simplifying or clarifying the main big categories of agriculture. And I hope that by the end of the presentation, your view on agriculture will be a little bit clearer. So the way this presentation will go is that I will be going over some types of agriculture. Some of them I will be comparing them to one another. Some I will explain how they came to existence. For some, I will just be explaining like what are their practices. And yeah, for some, maybe I will go over their principles. So I will be doing that. And now I will start with industrial agriculture. So industrial agriculture actually has another name, which is a bit less famous, which is conventional agriculture. And it came with the Green Revolution in the 60s. So the purpose was to feed everyone in the world and mainly like people in developing countries. But the big focus was on intensification of global food production. So this intensification came with the idea of optimizing. So optimizing the amount of food produced in a unit of land and a unit of labor and a unit of resource. And all of these ideas came with the practices and technologies that I think most of you here have heard of, but I will go over them. So they include monocropping. Basically, it means planting the same crop on a very large piece of land to be able to apply the same fertilizer, same amount of water, do all the same agricultural practices in a very fast and efficient way. Second one is dwarfing, which actually started with the dwarfing of cereals, but then it went to the dwarfing of other sorts of plants. The production of synthetic fertilizers and pesticides, breeding plants or creating hybrids that actually work in conjunction with the fertilizers and with the chemicals and with the big intense irrigation. So advanced irrigation, and finally the use of more machinery. So the result of all of this was basically using less inputs to create a whole lot of output. Some benefits which came with industrial, you can call them benefits, include like the creation of many job opportunities on many levels of agriculture. So it's not just a farmer, but it's scientists, engineers. Also, a lot of people started investing more in agriculture and food became more accessible and a lot cheaper. Now, before we move to the next type of agriculture, I would like to elaborate a little more on a practice that is very common in industrial agriculture, and that is tillage. So for those of you who aren't very familiar with what tillage is, it's basically the reshuffling of the soil, of the upper layer of the soil. Okay, so if you want to imagine it, it's basically like a huge mixer for the soil. Okay, and it happens in two steps. First one being the primary tillage, and the second one is the secondary tillage. The primary tillage's purpose is to slacken the soil and incorporate all the crop residues. And it usually happens at a deeper depth than the secondary tillage. And the secondary tillage is basically just to smoothen the surface and make it ready for sowing. Okay, so you can, like logically speaking, this step usually happens at the beginning of the season. Basically, it's a soil bed preparation. So we're preparing the land, making it look really nice and smooth to be able to start the planting. This does sound very nice. It actually makes the application of fertilizers very easy. It makes, like, it allows for roots to grow easily. Okay, but it does have some disadvantages. It's actually very costly economically, so because it requires a lot of fuel, and it's also costly environmentally. It causes soil erosion, and it logically, like, I think it's easy to imagine, it promotes the emission of a lot of greenhouse gases. And one third thing that tillage creates is something called a plow pan, which is a thick layer of impermeable soil, okay? Impermeable by the roots, okay? And here, I think, like, it becomes kind of contradictory to the purpose of tillage, because the purpose of tillage is to facilitate root growth, and the complete opposite is happening. So a lot of people started thinking of, like, how can we think of alternatives for tillage? And this is where conservative agriculture came. So the conservative agriculture revolves around three core principles. First one being reduced soil disruption. So they basically said, okay, let's stop doing tillage, or if we're gonna do tillage, let's do something called minimum tillage. So it's basically the secondary tillage only, okay? And the second principle is maintaining soil cover. So they allow organic matter to accumulate on the soil because it's very beneficial. And the third one is using crop rotation. So crop rotation means that every season you plant a different type of crop. That way you use your soil in the most efficient way. So this was like a first step towards sustainability. Conservative agriculture, they still use chemicals and fertilizers, but like this image to look at, like, the environment and how we can improve our soil health started to appear. So going from this first type of agriculture tackling sustainability in my presentation, I would like to talk about another type of agriculture where they're also looking at sustainability. And this is the precision agriculture. So precision agriculture is very precise, as its name says. It targets the exact rate of fertilizers and chemicals that are needed. So what happens is that it tells you when to apply fertilizers and where to apply fertilizers and pesticides. This is helpful for the environment, or not really helpful, but it reduces the negative impact on the environment because it reduces the amount of residual chemicals that end up leaching to the groundwater or going to other natural elements. It also avoids crops dying from nutrient imbalance, because when you start putting fertilizers randomly, some crops might not need them, and some crops might need more than you actually apply, which leads to crop loss. And also, it creates something that is very important, which is a reduction in pesticide resistance. So something that happens, like a result of industrial agriculture, is that a lot of pests end up getting resistance to the pesticides, which leads farmers to use more pesticide or another type of pesticide. And I think that this is obviously something very chaotic and messy. So precision agriculture does have some interesting long-term goals. but it is very costly. It requires a lot of maintenance, and it's actually a lot of hard work. It's not just the farm itself, but you actually need to collect data and to analyze this data. So another type of innovative agricultural system is the soilless agriculture. So soilless agriculture means that anything that is planted not in soil can be anything you can think of course, if the crop is growing. But now I will only be talking about hydroponics and aquaponics. So the hydroponic is the farm where crops are growing in a solution of water and nutrients. Since they live in a controlled environment, crops are growing all year round. And because of how the system is built, you can get a lot of yield in a much smaller space. Okay, just looking at the chat, I don't know if anyone is saying something. Okay, we'll do that later. Okay, yeah, sorry for the interruption. Okay, yeah, so it's a controlled environment, which means that you need to control the temperature, the water conditions, the air circulation. Okay, and there are two types of hydroponics. So we all know, I think, the closed hydroponic system, where the excess solution is brought back to the system and used over and over again. But there's also open hydroponic systems where the excess solution is actually thrown out. And this is very common in developing countries, or in like people who want to do the system but don't want to pay a lot of money for it. A second type of soilless agriculture is the aquaponics. So aquaponics is actually a combination of hydroponics, which I just explained, and aquaculture, which is growing of fish. So what happens is that there's a symbiotic association between fish and plants. Fish produce waste that is high in nutrients. This waste with the water goes to the lettuce in this picture, but it's like any plant, and that use it as a fertilizer and filter the water that later goes back to the fish. This is how the system works in a very simplified way. Of course, it requires a lot of skilled labor, because here you don't only need to know how to grow crops, you also need to know how to raise fish. But that doesn't mean that you don't need to have some skills to build a hydroponic farm. They're both quite demanding. They both use a lot of energy, but they're also both really efficient when it comes to water usage. And also to transportation, because since it's a controlled environment, you can actually build a hydroponic or an aquaponic system anywhere you want, including the rooftop of a building in the middle of the city, right next to where your market is. So this is like a really cool thing about hydroponics and aquaponics. Okay, so I think I mentioned it. They use a lot of energy because you have a pump that is constantly working. And if you're building them in a very cold area, you need to use heaters constantly. And one thing is that not all crops can be planted in hydroponics and aquaponics. For example, you cannot plant root crops like carrots or beetroots because they won't grow in water. You also can plant grain crops. And it's true that hydroponics and aquaponics do not require a lot of pesticides. But a lot of people criticize them because, okay, like, sure, it's great, we're not using pesticides and fertilizers a lot, but we're not really contributing to the health of the soil. So a lot of people look down on this type of agriculture because they're not really contributing to improving soil health. And this is why a lot of people said that, for example, they can't be considered organic because organic agriculture has other goals. And this is why now I will be talking about organic agriculture. Okay, so organic agriculture is a production system that sustains. And here I would like to focus on the word sustains, the health of the soil, the ecosystem, and the people. And it revolves around 4 principles, which are health, ecology, fairness, and care. Organic agriculture didn't start in the last few years or in the 21st century. It's actually a result of years of people fighting for it. From scientists, farmers, activists, into institutions. It's like a result, like it's the output of all those people fighting for it. So from Rachel Carson, who wrote Silent Spring, which was very inspirational for the organic and environmental movement, to the Rodale Institute that did a lot of big experiments that showcased how beneficial organic agriculture is, to the International Federation of Organic Agriculture movement, whose establishment in 1972 was a stepping stone for the organic movement. So I will, just like I did in industrial agriculture, I will be talking about like the main practices in organic agriculture, which include crop rotation that I previously discussed. So every season on the same piece of land, you plant a different type of crop. That way you use like the nutrients in your soil efficiently, and you avoid allowing some pests to live in your soil. The second practice is intercropping, which means planting crops that benefit each other next to each other. Third practice is minimum tillage, which I discussed. The use of organic fertilizers, so compost from plants and manure from animal waste, and cover crops, which means that when you're planting a specific type of crops, for example, here they're planting grapes, you don't let the soil just empty. You plant something in it. That way you avoid losing carbon, and you also add the organic matter in your soil. And finally, using more nitrogen fixing crops like most legumes. So I think that today, we all know that organic agriculture isn't just like a farming thing. It actually like evolved to become a whole industry. And from its principles, like in organic agriculture, they focus on sustaining the health of the soil, but not really improving it. So what they do is, okay, we're not gonna harm it, but we won't do much to make it like better. Okay, and this is why they also use practices like monocropping. So they do like, some farms you might find like small plots, but some big agricultural farms, you will find monocrops, and they really focus on increasing their yield to be able to compete. So after that, like I will be talking about other types of organic agriculture that use very similar practices, but their goals and their purposes are quite different. Okay, and a lot of people usually use them interchangeably. So they talk about them as if they're one type of agriculture, but they're actually different. And the main difference like between them is in their purpose, okay, or their principle. So the first one is agroforestry. So in agroforestry, there's a huge focus on the interaction between the agricultural crops and the environment. So we look at the relationship, how positive is the relationship between this crop and this tree, or this crop and this crop, or whatever. Okay, and how negative can this be? And then we weight things, like maybe some relationships can be more positive than the others, and according to this, decisions are taken. Okay, so they look at the interactions and the relations. The second one is the regenerative agriculture. So regenerative, I think it's like in its name, they focus on reversing the effect of climate change by rebuilding soil organic matter and restoring the degraded soil biodiversity. So they do that by using the same practices as organic agriculture, but the fact that their main focus is on improving soil biodiversity and like the water cycles and the vegetation and also the people, like they use the same practices but for a different purpose. Okay, and the last, so actually I just wanted to add this. It's the same thing as organic, but like one step further. And the last one is permaculture. So permaculture is usually referred to as a sort of design agriculture, and it's like a way to look at agriculture in a design way. Okay, and so this is what it usually is. Like most books about permaculture talk about how to design your farm. It looks very similar to agroforestry and to regenerative agriculture, but it's also different in its principles. So the principles of permaculture are care for the earth, care for the people, and fair share, which means returning the surplus to the earth and the people and sharing the resources and abundance. And this doesn't mean like sharing the resources between us and the land, but it's sharing the resources between the land, the animals, the other trees, the plants, and kind of like creating this self-sufficient system. Okay, so yeah, this is like those are the main types of agriculture that I would wanted to discuss about. I drew this chain, which is kind of a sustainability chain. Okay, and the way I did my presentation makes it seem like the most sustainable thing is agroforestry and regenerative agriculture, and the worst thing is industrial. But it's not really like this. Like, it's not all black and white. Sometimes organic can be bad. Sometimes conservation agriculture can be good. So this is how you should always look at it. Like, within each type of agriculture, there are several layers. And each layer should be looked at individually, okay? And according to this, you decide if it's sustainable or not. So sometimes someone might plant an organic farm somewhere very far away and will need to have a lot of transportation to be able to take it to the market. So this kind of puts it into question, like how sustainable is it? And sometimes conservation agriculture might be the only option the farmer has. So yeah, so this is like the last message I wanted to send, that it's not all black and white. And sustainability really differs from case to case. Okay, so thank you. I hope your view on agriculture is kind of clarified. And yeah, if you have some more questions, please wait for the Q&A.
Building on what Rémie just presented and how she showed us how complex this whole situation is, I would kind of like to make it worse. So I will show a lot of also very confusing and contradicting pieces of information. And yeah, I hope you will find it interesting. So first I thought to ask, and you can just type yes or no in the chat. How many of you have, or no, actually, let's do it with the reaction buttons. So just whatever reaction you feel like putting, but those of you who have thought about, you know, changing your diets to accommodate a more sustainable lifestyle, like I would just like to see hands up or something similar to see how many there are. Okay, that's a lot of you. Nice. So based on that, I will proceed now. So I would like to start with an example. So imagine that you're going to the grocery store, you're doing your daily groceries as usual. You're already thinking like, you know, I want to pick something that's somewhat sustainable or healthy, or, you know, also I'm really craving this piece of chocolate today, something like that. So you're in the store, you have this overwhelming amount of food you can choose from. And then you think, okay, let's, for example, pick potatoes. It's a vegetable, so it's supposed to be like a nice choice. It's very versatile. I can make it very easily. But then you encounter that, you know, there's 10 different types of potatoes coming from 5 different countries, and they all have random stickers happening that might tell you something and they might not, but they certainly make the choice very, very confusing. So because of this, today's presentation, I would like to talk about how to make our diet more sustainable. And I am definitely not here to tell you what you should do. I'm just here to kind of point out options and the two sides of the coin. So also on that note, a disclaimer is that this is going to be very much focused on the Western diet and how you can change the Western diet in the way that it becomes more sustainable. Because, for example, meat consumption is really prevalent here, but there's a lot of countries where telling people to eat less meat would make no sense because they barely eat meat anyways. So just a side note. And now I would like to just quickly go over the outline. So first, I'm just gonna define what a sustainable diet is. Then I will quickly mention its relevance, and then I will move on to how to mitigate our impact through the way we eat. But also, this mitigation has a lot of limitations too. And then I will quickly talk about certification, going back to that very first picture with the stickers. And then I will outline the general difficulties and the dilemma that we all face. Finally, I included some resources that I found kind of inspirational and like a good sign that, you know, people are thinking about these things. And then closing remarks. And finally, I just included some of the sources I used to make this presentation. So what is actually a sustainable diet? The definition I found says that those diets with a low environmental impact that contribute to food and nutrition security and to a healthy life for present and future generations. But it also involves 6 more aspects. The first of them, you have to keep in mind the protection of biodiversity and ecosystems. You have to consider culture and the way people eat. You have to think in terms of accessibility. You have to come up with a solution that's economically fair and affordable, because otherwise it doesn't work, of course. It has to be nutritionally adequate as well, because health is very important, no matter sustainability. And you have to make sure that it's safe. Also the production of the foods, also the processing, like the whole, like until it reaches your plate. So one more thing that I found very important to emphasize is that sustainable does not mean healthy. So if you're following a sustainable diet, it can actually really easily go wrong if you're not mindful about it and you only look at what's the most sustainable thing. So with that in mind, why is it important that we care about what we eat? First of all, we all know that the global population is growing and growing, and this happens against a limited amount of resources, and these resources are not growing with it. So the more we grow, the more obstacles we're going to hit. And also just some numbers. So the food industry is responsible for 26% of our greenhouse gas emissions, and it uses 70% of all the water that is consumed also for domestic use, for industrial use, and all those kinds of things. So because of these really big numbers, if you change the way we eat, it can also have a very big impact. So I found that changing our diets could actually contribute 20% to the effort that's necessary so we can keep the temperature rise below the 2 degrees that is now being aimed at. So with that in mind, what can we actually do? We have the 3 kind of main recommendations. The first one is to reduce our meat and dairy intake. The second one is to eat less. And the third one is to follow a local diet. So I would like to explain these a little bit more. As we all know, the livestock industry has a really big impact. So in developed countries, it makes up most of the greenhouse gas emissions that these countries produce. So it makes up 70% of all food production. It just comes from livestock, which I think is a really crazy number. And also animal agriculture uses up 20 to 33% of our freshwater resources, which, considering that there's a lot of other things using water, is also a pretty big number. And something else I found really interesting is that the Earth's surface, 45% of the surface of this globe is covered with livestock or livestock-related activities like pastures and the processing industry. So almost half of our globe serves to create meat and dairy. So that's pretty crazy, I think. Then we're coming to the eating less point. Well, I think it makes very logical sense. If you eat less, your consumption goes down, so the demand goes down, so food production would also follow suit. And also, it's a pretty big deal because most of the developed world is experiencing this obesity epidemic, and there's really such a high percentage of obese people, which is not only a problem for the resources, but it's only a really big problem for our own health. So this would kind of solve two problems at the same time if people would pay a bit more attention. And finally, with the local diet, I think a lot of you might have already heard about, for example, there's the Mediterranean diet involving a lot of vegetables and fruit and olive oil. There's some fish included, but there's only a moderate amount of meat and dairy in this diet. And also, it's based on locally produced vegetables and locally produced fish. Another, a little bit newer version of this is the Nordic diet. So it's prevalent in Scandinavian countries, and it's based on what's available there. So it's based on wild berries, it's based on wild meat, for example, reindeer, and native fish, native seafood, and rapeseed oil, and barley and rye, because they grow way better over there than wheat. So with these diets, the nice idea is that you get all your food from local sources, saving transportation. Also, you usually use clean ingredients, as you can see from the pictures, so it's not packaged food. So it's supposed to be healthy too. And usually it aligns with your culture as well, because historically this was the food available to the people living in the area. But having said that, unfortunately, all these solutions have their limitations. So considering the first one, reducing meat and dairy, it can lead to nutritional deficiencies. Like, you really have to be smart about it if you've been eating meat and dairy your whole life, how to transition or how to reduce your intake, while keeping in mind that there's vitamins and nutrients that might not be so easily available and ready in plants. And also, a lot of people just feel like this is a really big step and a little big sacrifice because it's so much part of our lives that we just don't know how to even go about it. Secondly, eating less. I think we all know that feeling when we gather with our friends and there's this table full of food and everyone is really happy. So I think, independent of cultures, this is something that we all experience. So eating is this social activity and it's embedded in our culture. So telling people to just eat less is a little bit problematic in this sense, because we all love to eat and we love flavor, and yeah, so that's one problem with it. And with the local diet, now we're all used to having, for example, Indian food available in Freising or Italian food available literally anywhere in the world. So if you're confined to your local diet, you might feel like you're losing out, or you might feel like it's boring. And another thing I found is that local is actually not necessarily more sustainable. I found this study that was looking at tomatoes and how there was this set of tomatoes produced in the UK, but it was grown in these greenhouses and fossil fuels were used in the process. And their greenhouse gas emissions were actually 5 to 6 times bigger than those tomatoes imported from Spain, where they could be grown outdoors, even though the transportation was still accounted for in this evaluation. So now we're coming to certified products. Like, what about them? Why are they such a big deal? So ideally, they live up to certain ideals. Like, they are either ethically produced, they are environmentally friendly, they are socio-economically sustainable, or try to address more of these concerns. And very often, they actually fulfill some of these criteria. However, what I find a little bit misleading is that a lot of times they are also just serving as kind of a catchphrase. So, for example, supermarkets or these big chains can increase the price because, you have this tag, so you think you're willing to pay a little bit more for something that has a positive impact. But in reality, it doesn't always. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is that there's, for example, with organic producers, there's a lot of producers that actually would fulfill the criteria for organic production and could be certified, but these certification processes are quite expensive and small-scale farmers don't usually have the finance to afford this. So that's also something that is a drawback to this whole certification idea. Now, I would like to come to just general difficulties facing us when we think about a sustainable diet. Well, what studies found is that actually a lot of people are not even aware what it would mean to eat sustainably. Like they don't have the knowledge and they don't even know how to start. So that's one big problem. The other one is that there's this lack of incentive and willingness because people don't see a short-term personal gain from trying to follow a sustainable diet. So it just seems like too much effort for something that's not beneficial for you at the time. Then a lot of people find that it's very costly, which I found a study conducted in Sydney where they looked at 5 different districts that all had different income levels. And they actually found that if you buy a basket of goods and then you kind of do the same basket but with healthy and sustainable ones, then the area that had the lowest income levels had the biggest difference between the general products and the sustainable ones. So that's a very interesting point, I thought. The popularity of diet trends. What I meant here is that, for example, there's a lot of promotion of these low-fat, low-carbohydrate, high-protein diets. And thinking about sustainability, that does not necessarily work because a lot of the time that involves high amounts of dairy, high amounts of meat, and as I pointed out before, that might be a little bit problematic. And also with some solutions that are small scale. So for example, the local diets I mentioned before, they are not really convertible to large scale models, either because the whole idea is that you eat what is there, so it's not going to be applicable everywhere. Or if you try to make it larger scale, then for example, you have to start farming reindeers. So it would literally just be the same as the beef industry these days. So that's kind of a limitation there. So this kind of brings us to the point I am trying to make. So we have this triangle, and what I found is that you can't really get all the 3 criteria to work. You have to make a choice because, for example, you can decide that you would like to go environmentally friendly and healthy, but as I mentioned before, that can result in you having to buy more expensive things that you might not be able to afford. Another thing you can do is that you decide to be environmentally friendly and affordable, but that can mean you're not healthy because studies found actually that a lot of these high added sugar content products and a lot of pastries are actually really easy to manufacture. So they're relatively environmentally friendly and they are usually cheap and very easily available. But if you just eat, donuts all day, every day, that's not really gonna look nice in the end. And finally, if you're trying to be healthy and affordable, that's also a way, but that could include, for example, a lot of dairy, like yogurt is relatively cheap, at least around Europe. So you're back again at this clash of what is more important to you. So with that in mind, I found some resources that I thought were kind of inspirational because I was just getting lost in thought and I saw all these solutions and then how they are not actually solutions. So I wanted to bring something positive too. So the first one is the Sustainable Food Systems Program. It's this multi-stakeholder initiative started by the government of Switzerland, the government of Costa Rica, and WWF. And they are focusing on kind of promoting sustainable production and consumption in cooperation with NGOs, with governments, with civil society, with the private sector. And it's a relatively new initiative, so there hasn't been super much feedback yet, but I think it's a really nice one. Then there's also the Slow Food Network. It focuses more on culture and the embeddedness of food in culture, and its main idea is that you should eat foods that kind of your grandmother would consider as a food, but also keeping in mind quality, taste, the healthiness of what you eat, and environmental sustainability, and that the production process is fair to the producers, so they have equitable conditions and good pay. And the Slow Food Network actually opened, I found it really interesting, a culinary school too. So I think that's pretty nice. And they have a biodiversity foundation to kind of restore or just conserve biodiversity at the production sites. Then this Neighboring Food Co-ops Association is just an example. It's in the UK and it's made up of 40 corporations and startup initiatives. And they are just trying to make this mini economy that's rooted in healthy, just, and sustainable regional food. So they are just producers coming together to kind of form their own like small supply chain in a way. And then Rob Greenfield, he's this LA-based activist, but I thought his story was quite interesting. It's also a website. So he's done a lot of very interesting things. Like at some point he started a zero waste campaign. Then he decided that it's not enough. So for a whole year, he only ate food that he either grew at home himself or he foraged around in the area or like went into the woods to look around what's edible. He kind of documents this whole thing. It's very interesting. And he also did a project about discarded food and saving food waste or kind of including it back into people's diets or reusing it in certain ways. So now after I kind of dropped a lot of information, I just want to say that everything is all fine. There's like a lot of controversy, but I think, and what I would like to be the message of the presentation is that we don't have to be raw. We don't have to go all in because obviously our lifestyles wouldn't necessarily allow it. We don't have to all instantly become vegan or feel bad about not being completely vegan because it's a really, really complex situation. And as Rémie said in her presentation too, it's not black and white. It has multiple sides and there's so many perspectives that different people have to consider. Like we all have different preferences and different circumstances. So with that in mind, I would just like to ask you guys to keep an open mind to all of this and, you know, don't feel discouraged if you feel like you're not doing everything because everything is a really big word. So, you know, just small changes can already make a difference, or being aware or spreading awareness or just having a conversation about this. So I would like to thank you for the attention and I hope you learned something or you see the complexity a little bit better.